Welcome to Raising the Bar, Engineering Edition. I'm Steve Dandino, Executive Director of the Reinvention Collaborative, and I am pleased to introduce another segment in our ongoing professional development series designed to foreground online course design and pedagogical expertise in academic and professional disciplines, which complements online course expertise located in teaching learning centers and global campuses. On behalf of the RC's 80 Research University members, I want to thank leaders in the University of Nebraska-Lincoln College of Engineering for organizing this webinar. And I am pleased at this time to turn the floor over to Dr. Heidi Diefes-Dux, Professor of Engineering Education and lead for the Discipline-Based Education Research Initiative in the College of Engineering at UNL.
Thank you, Steve. Our panel of engineering faculty, we're very happy to participate in the Reinvention Collaborative's Raising the Bar initiative. Our goal for today is to really talk about 4 aspects of effective remote and online instruction from the perspective of engineering faculty, where our experiences range from blended instruction to delivery of full online courses. The 4 aspects we're going to talk about today are content delivery, student engagement, hands-on activities, and assessment. You know, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly impacted our experiences with remote and online instruction, and that's going to undoubtedly add dimensions to our discussion today. But our intention is really to share teaching strategies that we believe are effective both under pre-pandemic and pandemic conditions. I'd like to introduce our panel members. I have with me Alisa Gilmore. She is in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. She has experience with both blended instruction and distance teaching. Keli Herstein is in the Durham School of Architectural Engineering and Construction. She's an active member of the American Society of Engineering Education and incorporates evidence-based strategies in her teaching. Jena Asgarpoor is also with the Durham School of Architectural Engineering and Construction and is the director and chair of the Master of Engineering Management program. Her expertise is in full online course delivery. I also have with me Carl Nelson in the Department of Mechanical and Materials Engineering. He has experiences with blended instruction. And then I have myself, I'm in biological systems engineering, and I have experience in blended instruction. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tareq, director of the Engineering and Computing Education Core team that works with engineering faculty on engineering education topics. He's going to facilitate our discussion on these 4 aspects that we want to talk about today.
Thank you, Heidi. So we'll start with the first aspect. And Heidi, I'd like to ask you this question, and this is on the delivery of content aspect. What have you found to be the most effective ways to deliver content to students within the context of delivering content remotely?
So in my former life, prior to coming to UNL a couple years ago, I worked in a first-year engineering program where our enrollment in our first-year classes was somewhere between 1,500 and 1,600 students. And we switched to flipped delivery of the course almost a decade ago. And I had a lot of experience doing content curation for video content for the flipped video content. I was also really fortunate that I had staff that dealt with all the technical production of that content. But the things I walked away from that experience were that I was able to use this last spring when suddenly I had my own small class and I had full responsibility for that flipped style of instruction, was that you have got to have clear, measurable learning objectives that are focused on observable behaviors. Because if you don't do that, then you have nothing to align any video content that you're going to produce to. And you need that to kind of keep iterating on, am I being focused? Because if you can't be focused, then you can't produce short videos, which I think are also key. You've got to be in that 5-10 minute window of length of video content. Otherwise, they're just too long. They're boring. They go in random directions. And I think that having those learning objectives really helps someone stay focused. I also had to learn the technology to produce video content. And I was very fortunate that Jena really advised me, go VideoGrid or VidGrid. And because it was so simple, and it really was. And I think identifying simple technologies to get you up and going with the creation of content is key so that you don't get bogged down in the technology.
Would any of our other faculty would like to chime in on the question?
Yeah, I can go. I agree with everything that Heidi says. Of course, alignment of learning objectives and course activities and assignments, and then ultimately assessments is very important. But really the delivery and how you deliver it, whether you are in a classroom or online, it doesn't matter. Teaching is teaching. Really has to do with the subject. I mean, for some subjects, for instance, there will be a lot of lecturing. There will be video, instructional video, for example, that you may want to put together. But for another subject type, for instance, you may want to do that still, but really integrate a lot of other resources that are relevant, like readings of articles and then discussion of maybe students visiting blogs and podcasts and TED Talks, and it depends on the subject. And so it's important to be open and not go at it a certain way, and just have that flexibility that is required for the subject matter and for the students in that level of course.
Thank you, Jena. What about, I'd like to ask another question just from within the delivery of content aspect. What are some of the best ways faculty, engineering faculty, can structure weekly online content in a course using a learning management system? I know that we use Canvas here at UNL. Can someone on our faculty panel maybe tell us about how they go about structuring their online content?
I can jump in for that. One of the best ways I found is to structure the weekly content into an arrangement called a module. And so a module consists of 1 week of the activities, the assignments, of what the student is expected to do. And like Heidi mentioned, one of the best ways to do this so that both you as an instructor, we stay focused on what we want to deliver and what the students are expected to master, is to align those modules to specific learning outcomes. So then the student is basically trained to know that each week I can post a module, module 1 for week 1, module 2, week 2. These are the chunks that I need to master and to do. So module structuring has been really, really effective.
To add to that, another aspect that I think is important is to make sure that students know where everything is, that all of the pathways and the kind of navigation that you build into your course, whether it's in Canvas or any other course content management system, presents everything right in front of the student. When I link my VidGrid videos, for example, I have a main landing page where each video is given by the date that is associated with it. What Alisa was saying about modules, it would correspond to the module. And it also is given a topic. So if they want to go back later and find the content on a certain topic that they need to review for an exam, for example, it's right there on their main landing page, and they can find anything they need to find easily. And I think that's important to get students, give them the tools that they need really to access all your content easily.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I've started using are guided lecture notes, and I use those for in-person classes, but those have transitioned well to online. And then I label my videos Unit 1, Page 1, and then a separate video for Unit 1, Page 2, and they can quickly go back and forth in between examples.
As everyone has said, consistency is really the name of the game. So regardless of how you decide to do it, it's really important to be consistent from those module 1 to module 2 to module 3. So one way that I do it is I have, you know, an overview for that module. It could be in video form, it could be in text form, but the students sort of like are introduced into what are we going to talk about. And then there's a learning objectives and exactly mapping those learning objectives with all of the various assignments or activities that they must do so that they know if I'm doing this thing, it's not just busy work, it's tied because I should learn this and this and this objective. And then of course, all the learning resources are there, and then all the activities that they must do. And then finally, the assignments and the deliverables are all there. So it's, you know, consistency is really important. And one thing that I do is for every class, I call it tour de class video. And this is something that I started 15, 20 years ago. And it's a video where at the beginning of the class, I take 10 minutes and I take them through all the course navigation, so that I'm showing them where everything is, what they need to do on a regular basis every week. And that really puts an ease and removes the stress from being in an online class, as our expectations, of course, are different as they go from one class to another. And so for every faculty to do that, it sort of takes away the pain for the students.
Thank you, Jena. I think that actually helps us kind of transition into our next aspect, our next area, which is the student engagement piece. So similar to looking for strategies to help engage the student with the online content, like Jena just mentioned. Keli, maybe I can ask you this question. What have you found to be the most effective ways to engage students within the context of delivering content remotely?
Are you asking me?
No,
I'll actually take
yeah.
that question. So yeah, with engaging students, and I think this does carry over very well to what we were just talking about. So for me, the name of the game is structure. So I would say 3 things have been really key. The first is to establish a weekly structure for the course. We talked about modules, and I'll go a little bit more into that. Establish a weekly structure, communicate the structure early, and reinforce it often. And the third thing is to tie accountability into that structure. So we have a lot of different things that we bring as faculty, different expertise. And sometimes I've heard, you know, colleagues to say, well, I told them to do this, and then they come to class and they haven't done it. So I think these are 3 ways to really set it up early. So we talked about the structure of modules. As Jena went through, the different things are linked to learning outcomes. Carl mentioned that the videos are linked there. So the structure, read, watch, and do is one that I have used, and it has been very effective in terms of setting up the expectations. So students come to class wanting to know what is expected of me in this class. So the weekly structure is a module. These are the learning outcomes. For every learning outcome, you're expected to read something in the text. You're expected to watch a set of videos on that learning outcome, and you're expected to do some stuff. And so the doing is easily facilitated with the automatic feedback with short quizzes or problems they should work before class, or other things that they should do, simulations. So the second tenet is that you have that weekly structure, but we really only have a short window to capture the students' attention. That first week of class is optimal. It's prime territory for doing that. And so communicating the structure early and reinforcing it often is communicating that. I email my students the week before. So I actually set that expectation up to get their attention that they have to read, watch, and do even before they come to class. And usually it's an orientation, you know, like Jena mentioned, the tour of the class. I like that name. I haven't used that name before, but I send a video out and I say, where I tell them everything and the video that they should see in Canvas, our learning management system. So telling students multiple ways, and then requiring them to actually go through the orientation module and then have an accountability to email me or to do something to indicate that they have done that and that they are required to do that before you step into the first day of class. And this is for a blended scenario, or even if it's not, to say by this date you need to have this and have some accountability, which ties into, you know, the next part of it, the accountability. Without accountability, students are not necessarily going to do everything, you know, and all the students are not going to do anything. And so even if it's a low stakes accountability, which I use for a lot of the pre-class work, it's their first exposure and they have short quizzes, and actually allow them to just continue to retake the quizzes. But they have to do read, watch, and do by a certain date before they come to class. And then it's low stakes, but it gives them something to say, I have done this. And then depending on the nature of the class, if it's purely remote, you don't have this lever to pull. But if they have to come in class, the expectation is that you have covered all of that material. And now we're going to go on to something deeper, and you're going to be, you know, great. You're going to be expected to do problems based on that knowledge. So I would say those three things: establish a structure, communicate it early, and reinforce it often, and tie some sort of accountability to help, you know, people stay on track.
I'd like to, I really appreciate you sharing those three tenets, and maybe Keli, you could take those thoughts and talk us through maybe what you have found to be the most effective ways to create community within the context of delivering content remotely. And then as a group, we can talk about student engagement.
You know, I've noticed that you've got to be just extra creative during these times to really get students engaged. It's one thing to look a student in the eye, be across the room from them. It's another thing to be miles and miles away. And you have to be flexible. You have to realize that everyone has different situations and that we're going to be working at some odd hours sometimes, and be extremely flexible with that. I experimented with the discussion board within Canvas for a little bit, and that was kind of clunky. I've started using Yellowdig, which is more of a social media type platform that students are more familiar with. They seem to like that quite a bit. I started doing this in my in-person classes, which every week I assign students to a different group. And so they walk in the classroom and it's broadcast up. I have Canvas randomly assign a group, and then they have to work together to do a hands-on activity. When we moved to online, I still assigned those groups and still had activities. They may had to communicate over Zoom, or they could do it over email, or just other ways of communicating, but still working together. And I think that when students, sometimes when they get settled into a group for an entire semester, sometimes, you know, some will kind of lean back while others will lean in. But if it's a new group and you're constantly changing, it's a constant first impression that you're trying to make. I've had some good luck with that. Students have also met some of them are juniors and seniors, and they've never met someone that's been in their classes with them for a couple of years. And so it's building new relationships, getting them outside of their comfort zone, which they hate at first. But they like later on, but then they take that into other classes with them because now they've met new people. A big thing with my classes that I reminded my students about is, at least in Canvas, notifications aren't necessarily turned on by default. So some of my students aren't receiving notifications about what's going on in class, and they say, well, I didn't know, that's why I didn't turn it on. So I remind them several times throughout the semester, and I show them how to click, how do you click on those notifications. I also set notifications for myself in my phone. So sometimes responding to some of the discussions, I get busy and sometimes forget. And so I set myself a notification that says, hey, go check Yellowdig, make sure that you're up to date on that. So just trying to be engaged, checking the people. I kind of see when the last time they logged in, if it's been a while for someone since they've logged in, sending them an email, checking in, hey, how's it going? What's going on? Showing students you care makes them want to work for you, is what I found.
Would any of our other faculty maybe would like to comment on some of the ways you as faculty can help ensure or encourage students will remain engaged in an online course?
I can get us started. You know, so one of the things I've been thinking about is, what does it really mean for a student to be engaged? What are the dimensions of engagement? And I've been thinking about 4. One is kind of that community interaction element of interacting with the instructor. And what does the instructor bring to the party? You know, you're trying to build rapport, they're bringing their life experiences, and in some ways, those things should be motivating to students. Then there's that interaction that's with peers, and I think that, you know, the focus of that often is around this issue of retention, being part of a larger community, but also developing the skills and abilities to use the new knowledge that you're learning and starting to actually say the words and make sense of those words with your peers. We talked about engagement with content, but I also think there's engagement with a process of monitoring and thinking about whether or not you're making progress with respect to the learning objectives. And so when I think about any given class, I'm thinking about, well, what of those 4 things is really important? What is the prioritization of those 4 things? And I think it depends a lot on what is the development stage of the students, where are they in their curriculum, what is the content of this course, and you kind of have to think through then, based on those things, you know, what's important here. One of the things that I've really gotten into is using reflection and making it a consistent part of the course every single week. So it's part of my modules, that every module ends with a very structured reflection that has students think about what actions they've taken to really learn the content, self-evaluate their abilities with respect to the learning objectives, and then think through a plan going into the next week and really write that out. It takes some training to get the students to write good reflections, but a couple weeks into the semester, I think as an instructor, you really have a handle on what we've been kind of tossing around this term presence, student presence in the course. And I found this to be very helpful for me and the students.
Tareq, can I say something?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Well, with respect to what you asked earlier about how to engage the students with the content, what's really important is for them to understand, and this is not just for online, this is for any kind of teaching, but for them to really understand, why is it important for me to learn that thing that you're trying to teach me? So how does it impact you, your future, your success, your career? If they get that, if they understand that, then they're going to be in it, most of them 100%. Using a variety of resources and activities is really important. Just using a book and read it and take these 3 tests really isn't going to cut it. Interactive assignments, such as questions, for example, that are embedded into a VidGrid video to get them engaged is really important. Activities and learning assessments should be applied as opposed to just very theoretical, or at least a combination of the 2. And then let them co-create their educational experience. And by that, I mean, this could be something very small. This could be, for instance, if you're having a discussion assignment, let them have 3, 4 questions that they can choose from so that they can tailor it to what it is that interests them. Or for example, if it's a project, maybe you can have 2 or 3 different options for them to choose from. Do I want to do a research paper or an applied work or a field study? And then use the discussions to encourage them and pose questions and epiphanies and insights that they have had so that other students can piggyback on it, and then it just mushrooms into where you can't even stop it.
I could add an example also that I think builds on Alisa's idea of, I've lost the word that she used, but the low cost, low stakes assessments, and also a couple of Heidi's 4 principles that she mentioned. And that is, you know, if we think about an in-person class, some people use clickers to get that kind of frequent engagement and interaction with students. And I think we can do the same thing in a remotely taught class. For example, if I'm using Zoom to run a synchronous remote session, I can introduce a clicker question, and we can use tools that are built into Zoom to do student responses. And I found that to work really well. I think in an in-person class, part of engagement is keeping students' attention and being cognizant of their attention span. And I think it's even more important when you're teaching a remote class. And so those kinds of things I think, help to break up the lecture or the session that you're running. Like Jena was saying, make it co-creative. When students respond to those things, they're helping to contribute to a discussion. And often those clicker questions launch us into a really good discussion that gets us deeper into the content than we would have been otherwise.
Would anyone else like to add to the student engagement piece before we move on to our third aspect? Okay. So transitioning on to the idea of just hands-on activities in general, Carl, let me ask you this question. What have you found to be the most effective ways to transition hands-on activities to remote experiences?
Well, I think there's a lot of options, and the option that might be chosen really depends on the goals of the hands-on activity. Hands-on things are used to do a lot of, to achieve a lot of different purposes. So for example, we might be interested in building team skills, or we might be interested in teaching students how to use a certain piece of equipment or an instrument. A lot of times it's related to data collection or data analysis, especially for lab type courses. Sometimes we want to give a hands-on experience so that there's greater depth and an ability to interpret results. And sometimes it's just for engagement, and it goes back to the engagement piece. But in each of those rationales for doing a hands-on activity, there are different ways that we can break it down, reflect on what it is we're trying to achieve with that, break that, those goals down into their parts, and then prioritize how can we use different tools that are available in a remote teaching scenario to achieve those. So for example, if our objective is to build team skills, then there are great online resources for facilitating teamwork. So some of those are built into our Canvas or other learning management system. Sometimes we might recommend students to use Zoom, or we might recommend other platforms like, let's see, I'm blanking, Discord, for example, or some of these other team communication apps. If we want to train students to use an instrument and really get their hands on what it feels like to use a piece of equipment, sometimes we can use videos or other types of multimedia as a virtual tour or a virtual guidebook. So for example, if I want to train somebody to use a machining tool, the feels, how it feels to touch the machine and feel the vibration back from it and hear the sounds that it makes, those are important things. So any kind of multimedia that I can use to get those stimuli and inputs back to the student. Some people program simulations. So, you know, you turn a virtual knob on a GUI in a simulation and you virtually see the instrument respond. So there's those kinds of things that are available or that can be created. For lab type courses, if your intent is to help students to learn how to collect data, sometimes it doesn't really matter whether it's the actual type of data that you had originally designed for a lab experience or hands-on experience in a controlled setting. Maybe you can change the type of data that is collected. And I've seen examples of this in non-engineering classes as well, where maybe it's a reflection experience that's being assigned, and rather than reflect on some object that is presented to them in a face-to-face class, maybe they're reflecting on something that they have in their home environment. In the context of engineering labs, you know, it's possible to send home a kit of data acquisition instruments, or an electronics kit, or any various type of you know, set of materials that would facilitate a data collection and data analysis experience. Sometimes we can have TAs collect actual data and distribute that to students if the goal is really to operate on real data from a real machine or instrument or apparatus. But sometimes it's okay to create surrogate data, or what I would refer to as fake data, and just distribute that if really what you want students to do is to analyze that. If you can build into that fake data the elements that would be characteristic of the real data, then your purpose is achieved. So yeah, I think that more or less summarizes, there's just a lot of different options available for how you can transition a hands-on experience into a virtual or remote experience, depending on what it is you want to achieve. Remember that it's all about reflecting on the learning objectives, breaking those objectives down into their parts, prioritizing them, and then using the tools at our disposal to tackle those most important learning objectives.
Thank you, Carl. Would anyone else like to talk about the transition of hands-on activities to remote experiences or the context of laboratories in engineering?
You know, actually, I'd like to comment. So I don't teach a engineering lab per se, but I have a lot of hands-on activities. So the classes that I usually teach, it's not in a traditional lecture hall, it's in a collaborative classroom. So one of the things that I've done is I've adapted my activities so they can either be done alone or they can have their families join in. So if it's something you need 2 people to do, you could have your roommates do it. And I've done videos with my family helping me. I'm teaching a class right now in Lean, and we're talking about this between pull production and push production, and there's a commonly used dice game. And anybody can roll dice and pass chips around and keep track of that. I mean, my 5-year-old can do it. And so it's just something kind of fun to do, but you still get the experience, and students come back and they reflect on what happened in the activity and they have to analyze what happened, but they got to play a game in the meantime. So just, again, being creative.
I will like to add in that's awesome, Kelly, that this is a brave new world, and there are new technologies. Some have been around for a while, but they have a new significance because of the times we find ourselves in. And so I know in electrical and computer engineering, one of the things we're looking into is an actual device, a small circuit device that the students would buy and they would have, and they would connect it to their computer, and it will turn their computer into an oscilloscope, for instance, so that some of the lab work, they could actually have a kit and do that, you know, remotely, or, you know, wherever they are, at home or wherever, to be able to simulate like being in a real lab. And that's exciting to me because we're doing things in ways we've never done before. And it can also, you know, one hand, it's a break, and there's a stressful point, but it can lead to greater opportunities for students to really own their education. So if you're not just sitting in a lab, you're in your house with this and you're experimenting, I think that could lead to a lot, you know, more learning opportunities as well.
And I'll add that with these kinds of kits that you can take home and do those hands-on activities at home, it's important to have good guidance and documentation to guide those activities. So whether it's creating a worksheet or a video, a how-to, those are really important. And fortunately, some of the companies that produce these at-home lab kits actually create curricula to go with them. And so those worksheets may already be created and can really facilitate the workflow for instructors.
So it seems that the focus on the learning objectives was a common theme in our previous 3 aspects. And I think that helps us think through the next big step, which is assessment in these types of environments. And so, Jena, let's start with you. What have you found to be the most effective ways to assess students' learning within the context of delivering content remotely?
Okay. Well, the first thing is that whether remotely or not, again, I keep coming back to it, that teaching and learning is teaching and learning, whether it's done in the classroom, face-to-face, or online, or hybrid, or blended, or what have you. But assessment must be aligned with learning objectives, and this is critical. And for those learning objectives, we need to make sure that they are commensurate with the course level and with the people to whom it's intended to be delivered, so the content. And so, you know, whether you're creating a course for a freshman level class versus a graduate level class, those learning objectives have to be commensurate with that. And also the type of material that you want to teach has a lot to do with it. whether it's qualitative in nature, quantitative in nature, that has a lot to do with it. In an online class, one standard, and I'm going based on what Quality Matters, which is an organization that is devoted and dedicated to best practices in online and blended course design and delivery. It's called Quality Matters, and I have a couple of certifications from them. And in an online class, really, one standard is that there should be a variety of assessments, so assessment types and methods. And so you don't want to, I remember when I was really young and going through school, all we had to do was read this book, and then there will be 3 exams, and that was it. And we were lucky if there was maybe 10% homework grade. But in an online class, you do want to have a variety of assessment types and forms of assessing students. So that's really important. So, and by that, what is the student doing when you have a variety of assessments? They are engaged in a variety of activities. And so that is crucial to keep that interest level high, and for them to, for you to be able to assess different, if you use Bloom's taxonomy or any other kind of taxonomy, so that you are assessing them based on, and their learning objectives based on the level within the taxonomy and within the intent of the course and the type of teaching that you're doing at various different components of the course. Are you at the knowledge level, or are you at the evaluation level and synthesis? And then the other thing is that those assessment strategies have to be authentic, and they must work best for an online, if you're doing it in an online class, that they must be helpful to the students in an online environment. So we have heard over the last spring semester that when everything went remote teaching, that a lot of people were saying, well, how am I going to test them? How am I going to exam them? Well, in an online classroom, you can still test, but if those assessments are authentic, like project-driven and project-based, so that the students are really using what they have learned in the classroom and applying it, that's really the best method of assessing students in an online class.
I'd like to ask the group a question. So what might be some of the potential pitfalls with doing high-stake assessments online? And what are some strategies that any of you have found to be effective at mitigating those issues?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is academic integrity. It's what everybody's talking about, is they're concerned about, are students going to be honest in the way that they take these high stakes assessments? And there are technology tools to help us with that. But if we kind of take a step back and say, like Jena was commenting, how can we engage students in a broader variety of assessments? That can help us to create, maybe just rethink the way we do assessments in a course to make it more appropriate for a distance scenario. The other thing too to think about is, well, I've lost my train of thought. Apologize for that. I'll leave it there for now. Or maybe I'll jump back in if it comes back to me.
Would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, if no one else has, I will go ahead. I don't want to dominate the discussion. Okay, all right. Well, like I said, a variety of assessments is really good, but then maybe breaking up the assignments or whatever it is that the assessment into parts. For example, if you're doing a project, scaffolding it so that they will have, at the quarter point, midpoint, 3/4 point, they have some kind of a deliverable to give to you so that you can see their progress and you're helping them achieve if they're off track, maybe you can help them achieve that. And again, that's something that should be done even in the classroom. Or for exams, you can have exams, but why should an exam be only one type? Why not have an exam that has multiple parts? You could maybe have an exam that is multiple choice, and you do it, and then there is a essay portion, for example, that maybe you could do orally, schedule 10-minute time with your students if it's not a 150 student lecture, and have that in that fashion. And then maybe have a part of the exam that is group part of the exam, where you have 2 or 3 students working on something, and they could be doing it remotely, but if you're timing the exam. So there is a variety of things that you can do to really make sure that you're assessing well, and you're assessing the right things, and you're involving the students in a way that is not exasperating for them, and they don't feel like they're being suffocated by just exams and one form of assignment. Like I said, written oral exam, take-home, proctored or timed exam, objective, subjective, problem solving, have a blended format so that it would be more beneficial to them and to you in terms of assessing whether or not they're hitting those learning objectives.
I think that
The other thing I was thinking of is students' ability to access a high-stakes assessment on time.
If you don't mind, I'd like to share a lesson learned.
Sure.
Last semester, I was teaching engineering econ, and towards the end of the semester, with everything that was going on and creating all these exams and everything we had to do, and I had a really large class, I decided I would create a very large test bank that would choose, I think I had 200 questions, and it chose 30 or 40 questions out of this large test bank. And I thought, oh, okay, that'll take care of it. Well, I started getting lazy, and I was taking questions out of the test bank that came with the textbook, and put it in there. And all of a sudden I got a question from a student that said, hey, this question's missing an interest rate, which is vital for solving the problem. And so I went to look at the problem, and I was going to go ahead and remove it and then give points to the students that already received that question. And 7 out of the 8 students answered it correctly, except for that one student who contacted me. So I copied the question and put it into Google search, and sure enough, the entire answer key was in Google. And so that's just a word of caution if you're going to use, which lesson learned.
Heidi, you looked like you might have had a comment on the topic a minute ago.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple themes coming up here that I sense. I think one is that you've got to remove the high stakes nature of testing, because in general, that just promotes cheating. I mean, that's universally an acceptable concept, is that you stress the students, they are going to be put in a position where they're fearful of their grade. And I think variety, authenticity, I think that trifecta has really got to come into play. So more frequent assessments, greater variety of assessments, and authenticity of those assessments that look more like the way you would actually really use the content, the better off you're going to be with the successful assessment strategy.
So how do you choose and design assessments for your class then?
Learning objectives. It is my own mantra in every category we've talked about today. If you don't have a good handle on your learning objectives, and you know what the observable behaviors you want out of your students is going to be, I think you have a really hard time making authentic assessments, and assessments that actually produce data that's actionable for you or your students in moving their learning forward. I think it's just so critical to make all of your instructional decisions to have those good, actionable, observable behavior based learning objectives.
And to go back to what Jena was saying too, building on a taxonomy of levels of within those learning objectives, do I want students to have knowledge about this topic? Yes. And I also want them to be able to synthesize a greater piece of information that relates to that knowledge. And so, scaffolding an exam, having multiple levels of question type. I found that in the spring when I had to develop an online exam, it made me think really hard about the exam questions that I'd used in the past. And I found that, in some ways I could make a better exam, even though I was delivering it online, than I had made in the past, because I wasn't being quite as lazy about the reflection on my learning objectives and the layering of those different levels of taxonomy within those objectives.
Well, and the different domains, and I think you mentioned a piece of that when you're talking about having in our hands-on section, having students, for example, learn about teamwork. So the different domains also can play a role. I'd like to ask the group, and maybe we'll end with this last thought, but what role do you see for formative assessments in the context of delivering content remotely?
I can start with that, but before I do, let me just go back to what everyone just got done talking about. And I really am a believer in particularly in an online, but of course in any kind of teaching, is rubrics. Now, a lot of people think that rubrics make the job of the grading easier. That depends on you and how you want to use rubrics. I use rubrics to communicate to the students and tell me, myself, what it is important in that assignment and why am I assigning it. So when I have all that criteria and all of those different levels of performance, I'm really myself digging deep and finding out for myself, what is it about that assignment that is important and why am I assigning it? And when I communicate that to the students, I know some people don't want to share a rubric with the students and they just use it for grading. But if it's important enough for the students to know what it is that you want them to, how it is that you want them to behave, why not share it with them so that they will rise to that expectation level? So I wanted to say that in terms of how to design assessment. But then in terms of formative, of course, I think that's one reason why a variety of assessments is important. And I wholeheartedly agree with what Heidi said in terms of minimizing the number and impact of those high stakes assessments and just spreading it across many. In any course that I teach, there's at least 4 or 5 different ways of assessing individuals. And so giving them feedback at a level that is non-threatening and they're learning, and maybe it could be in a peer-to-peer level instead of learner to faculty, but at a learner to learner level, there's a lot of learning that can be done that eventually will move itself way up to achieving that learning objective that we intend for them. So that's important. I mean, designing courses that have activities and interactions that are learner to learner, learner to content, so that they're really digging deep into that material and then that you've provided to them, and then learner to faculty. So all those 3 types of interactions and assessing at all of those levels is quite important.
Thank you, Jena. Maybe we could, either answer to the first question of the role also of formative assessments. Any examples that the group could probably share, some of our other panelists, that other faculty could find useful?
I would say that for me, I'm a big devotee of an apprentice model of education, and that requires a huge amount of formative assessment. And I think, that term feels scary. I mean, we're talking about feedback to students, and whether that feedback is generated by the instructor, a teaching assistant, peers, that feedback is really necessary for students to hear and see it on their work as they're moving forward. Ideally, the thing that I really want to have happen when I do project work, and I think project work pairs very well with an apprentice model of education, is that the students have milestones, and those milestones get a huge amount of feedback that the students have to have formal ways of addressing so that they can't just dismiss it, and that they have to respond to that feedback as they're moving forward. And then there's no surprises at the end of the semester. A student knows what their success has been all along. And when you get to the end of the semester, you're like, okay, they learned what I had intended for them to learn, because they've had to keep going and reacting to feedback along the way. And for me, that kind of more securely ensures that all the students are getting to the end of the semester having met the learning objectives that were set out.
Would any of our other panelists like to share an example of how they go about formative assessments in that type of environment?
I think that was well said by Heidi. Just one quick example. In a low stakes formative assessment, let's say a homework assignment, I became converted to a frequent homework, frequent feedback model, and actually offering students the opportunity to resubmit homework that had been correct or marked wrong, to give them an opportunity for that additional step of learning and correcting, and then getting the knowing that they got it right at the end. And that preparation, that practice, I think is critical. And so incentivizing, we talked about incentives earlier, incentivizing those kinds of assessments to get students to practice and correct their mistakes, and not just get the grade, but learn what was hard about the problem and how to correct it and how to overcome that, I think is a really big piece of learning.
Well, we are at time now, so I would like to just thank everyone from my end, and then hand it back to Steve for some final remarks.
Oh, I have a final remark. It's wow. I have learned so much from you. This has been a really valuable discussion. And on behalf of, as I said at the outset, our 80 Research University members here at the Reinvention Collaborative, I want to thank each and every one of you for the benefit of your experience and expertise. And we will do our level best to communicate this webinar to our members and to share it freely with any members of the engineering disciplines, faculty across the country or world who surely could benefit from the experience at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So thank you so much.
Thank you.